blue, which means I think we're live to the general public. That's exciting. Hello, good evening, everyone. The chat is here. Can you hear us? How's the audio, folks? Give us a shout if the audio isn't working. Good evening. Oh, we have Samir Jaraj is here with us to talk about. In fact, let's go straight to let's do that immediately. Normally I kind of do a bit of dithering, but actually this time I can go straight in. Samir is here. Hello, Samir. Pleasure to have you along for tonight's show. Sorry that the tech is so shonky. At some point, it'll be really professional. You just dive in and it'll all be working. But until that day, jerry-rigged is how I best to describe this podcast. But there we go. Yes. Oh, everyone can hear us. Marvellous. Samir, yeah. So I think before we crack, I very briefly sort of say that I dragged you into this through you sent out a call for people to be involved in the project, which we'll talk about at the end of the. I'll put in a slide. We'll talk about that at the end. But little did you expect me to then say, "Oh, do you want to come on a podcast and talk about it?" But so I can only apologise.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's
It's always good to it's a really interesting topic, and just really kind of like good to explore it more, because I think there's still as we were saying in our kind of like when we had our conversation about and everything, there's just still so much that's relevant to the issues today.
It's just like this. I was getting like as I was putting the slides together, I was getting like a kind of a more increasingly claustrophobic sense of incoming doom with some of the financial stuff on this. It's like subprime mortgage lending. That's and bonds based on packages of mortgages. Yeah, that definitely went well. And this is definitely not another system of finance creating itself that's entirely self-perpetuating and absolutely fine. So anyway, we'll get to that. But first, we must have a look at, and I haven't done this for a while actually. In fact, this is possibly the first time I'm doing it this year. We have to look at the COVID statistics. So these are the transport statistics as a percentage of pre-COVID levels. And I haven't done my 2022 slide yet, so we're just looking at the overall crisis. And what we can see on screen here, we've got at the top here, we have cycling, which is in green. The bottom here, we have in blue, we have got railways. And the pink and the red, the pink is buses and the red is road transport, kind of private road transport. And this is kind of what's been happening recently. We had a big drop at Christmas, but I suppose reassuringly, there's been a big old climb again of the rail usage. So it's jumped right back up toward. There was a surge before Christmas, and then it's jumped right back up. So we're back up to it's not where it was, but we're back up to 60%, which is good. I was worried that we'd be back to square one, dropped right off again, but it seems to have climbed quite quickly, which is good. Road transport has pitched downwards, which is interesting, and cycling kind of back to 100% of pre-COVID levels. So there we go. That's the COVID stats, fresh off the press. We'll be keeping a close eye on that through the year as ever, but I'm hoping that by the end of this year, 2022, we'll be back to nominally 100% levels again, if government doesn't keep all these services not running, which it has, but that's another story. Onwards to the news, very briefly, because we've got a lot to get through tonight, but very briefly the news. All of you have been sending me these pictures of these things in Japan, and I just want to tell you all, yes, they're dumb. They don't make any sense. This is a bus. There is a road next to that railway. Why is the bus just not on the road? It's a bad train, and it's a very heavy bus. It's too small and too light a train. It's too heavy a bus. It makes no sense. Why have they done this? Answers on a postcard. These aren't a very sensible use of railway capacity, and they're certainly not a very good use of what looks like quite a shiny bus. Anyway, so they're in Japan. They're not very good. This chap. So Grant Shapps has announced there are going to be no more useless announcements, so we can look forward to him closing his Twitter account. For some reason, the culture war has invaded the railways, and we're all sick of announcements, apparently. And so here's Grant Shapps saying time and again, repeated over and over in this subtitles for our own amusement. He did an announcement saying that he's going to get rid of unnecessary announcements, which no one really cares about. and is possibly the most trivial and unimportant thing that I could possibly think of as an issue to deal with on the railway. And what's even funnier is that it later turned out that the government does not have the power to instruct train companies to stop announcements ministers deem to be unnecessary, and there are no plans to legislate for this. So that's really good stuff there. Really, really useful use of public money to create that snazzy video that you did. So great. What else is in the news? I'm afraid it continues to be this dispiriting. Bus Back Better got binned. Bus Back Better has been ripped apart by the Treasury, as we'd always expect. Bus Back Better was actually a really good report. One of the better things that's been championed by this government, which is to a strategy to improve bus services quite radically across the country, across the whole UK, and obviously Treasury have said no. So that's really good. So the railways and the buses both suffering from Treasury's disinterest at the moment. And that's Noel Dolphin, friend of the show and Patreon support, actually. Thanks, Noel. Pointed out something that I thought was really interesting, which is that when you've got these plans being kind of announced and then shredded within kind of only a few months, it explains why a lot of local authorities and regions just don't submit submissions to these funding competitions, because they already have limited resources and they can spend time, money and effort writing a bid only for that money to just never materialise. I think, it's a really good point. We wonder why we're not seeing more kind of station reopening announcements and all these things. It's because often those have to be led by local authorities that don't expect that money to materialise and don't have the resources to risk on such an endeavour. It's kind of catch-22, not healthy. Anyway, so there's that, and also, I suppose, interestingly, the integrated rail plan, which everyone is ragging on at this point, two interesting bits of contributory evidence, I'm using rabbit ears evidence, surfaced over the last week as part of the evidence being submitted to the Transport Select Committee, I think. I just submitted a pack to the Transport Select Committee. We'll see if they pick that evidence up. That'll be interesting. It'll be even more fun if I end up in front of the desks giving evidence. That'll be unnerving. Anyway, most fun is that is this particular document here, which is the Integrated Rail Plan for the North and Midlands Technical Annex. I've read through it, and it contains zero calculations. The whole IRP, the cancellation of some substantial rail infrastructure, is based on absolutely no analysis, which is fantastic. This is the Mott MacDonald report that possibly fed a little bit into it, possibly justifying it, but this whole document here, the Mott MacDonald document, this one, the one here, it has the line, does not fulfil government requirements and government aims scattered liberally throughout it. So anyway, we'll dig through those in a future episode. Let's not dwell on it, because we have to talk about Carillion. Samir is here to talk about Carillion. We're going to talk about Carillion. And, oh, good grief, there's so much to unpick. So I think, without further ado, and only 8 minutes into the episode, it's time to start. Welcome to tonight's Rail Natter! And as the Intercity 225 fades away, oh golly, there it is. It's a little Carillion entered the zeitgeist sufficiently for there to be Hornby car models of them. Good grief. There is Carillion. But before we talk about Carillion, we need to talk about Samir. Samir, hello, welcome. Sorry about that news, rattling through the news there at high speed. It's chaos. I'm sure you're watching from the wings and sort of seeing policy. I mean, it's true across all policy realms, I presume. It's the same sort of pain. Announcements that are possibly good, but mostly just Treasury saying no to everything, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much what happens nowadays. It's what happened always, isn't it? Treasury says no. Treasury says no, absolutely. So, Samir, it's a chance for you to introduce yourself. Tell us about yourself, and I suppose tell us about how you ended up digging around the Carillion story.
So I'm Samir Jaraj. I'm a journalist and author. I work part of my time at the New Statesman, mainly writing about policy, so Treasury says no stuff. And then part of my time is on freelance projects. So one of those happens to be on Audit, the sexy, attractive world of accountancy and numbers and governance, which kind of combines the fact that it's really important and
utterly mind-numbingly boring for most people and utterly impenetrable.
It's one of those challenges that it's one of those things that's so important and fundamental to everything and so impenetrable at the same time.
So the project is looking at some of the big audit failures that have happened in the past few years. So British Home Stores, Thomas Cook, Patisserie Valerie, and Carillion, all cases in which their auditors were heavily criticised, where they were fined, where there was significant failings, and where there was kind of quite a lot of reflection over what is the role of the auditor now, because they appear to be too cosy with the company's organisations they're auditing. And my specific job in that was to find people who were directly affected by the collapse of these companies. So employees, subcontractors, suppliers, to put, a human face on, as you said, this thing that can be kind of quite abstract and seem quite boring, but when it goes wrong, it goes very wrong, and tens of thousands of people can lose their jobs in a second.
Yeah, absolutely, and I suppose the reason we're picking on Carillion in particular is because as a rail adjacent podcast, ostensibly Carillion had its tendrils through the railways in a kind of pretty spectacular fashion, but the reality is a lot of the we're going to see more major company collapses in the kind of near future. All of the reports I read talking about Carillion said, this is going to happen again in an even bigger way pretty soon. It's almost absolutely guaranteed to happen. And then the subsequent things I was reading was like all the regulation that was supposed to be hardened up and toughened up after Carillion's collapse has just been watered right almost back down again to where it was before. And I mean, I might be overly pessimistic on that, but it just feels like not many lessons have been learned at all from Carillion. Maybe we'll talk a bit more, kind of touch a bit more on that later. So what we'll do is, I think, given that given that there's a risk that this might go on long because both of us find this quite interesting, despite the fact that it is quite dry, we shall press on. So let's get our 2 miniaturized faces in the top corner, and also let me resize the Skype window because of reasons. There we go. So Carillion, there's a little model defender. And I suppose the first question to answer, if we're going to go full sort of Socratic method, is what is a Carillion? What was Carillion? And I suppose to do that, I've put together a little potted history. Feel free to interject at any point, Samir, but I'm going to go through this little potted history. We're going to start with 1964, which is when there was a merger of several kind of construction companies, civil engineering companies, but primarily sort of materials and road building companies and road aggregate companies that formed what was kind of officially called Tarmac Derby, I think. And then they kind of they stopped calling themselves Tarmac Derby fairly quickly and were just called Tarmac. And they had the 7 T's here, which was their logo for quite a long time. This was Tarmac. And they were founded, I think it was primarily Midlands. They had their base in, oh golly, where was it? It was possibly Derby, actually, or near Derby. Anyway, they were like Midlands based, but obviously grew pretty rapidly. And in fact, grew pretty rapidly to become international. And this was their logo right the way until 1996, when they 90s-ified and got a slightly snazzier typefacey logo. But by this point, by 1996, they had worked, Tarmac had worked on, they'd moved from being just like a road aggregates provider to being a house builder in quite a big way. In fact, they were a major house builder through the 70s and 80s, particularly the 80s. Major civil engineering projects that they were working on, so like motorways galore. I think they built 10% of Britain's motorways, actually, Tarmac. I think pretty spectacular, sizable chunk of sort of roads being built, like major civil engineering projects globally. In fact, lots of projects. And then from 1996 moved to 1999, and they were told by, or it's a mixture of their own decision. You might know better than me on this. A mixture of their own decision, or they were told to enact a demerger. So their demerger involved splitting what eventually is today Tarmac as part of CRH, and splitting away from that in 1999 was Carillion, and this was Carillion was formed of their their civil engineering contractor business, so the kind of the construction business, right? So not the bits that did materials and sort of aggregates, also not the house building bits. The house building bits, they did a bit of a swap. I think the house building bits, Carillion or Tarmac and Wimpy did like a bit of a swap, I think. So the house building bits of Tarmac went to Wimpy, and the civil engineering bits of Wimpy went to Tarmac, which then ended up in Carillion, I think. Correct me if any of this is not quite right, Samir, but I think this is basically what happened. So there's a demerger which created Carillion in 1999. And between 2001 and 2014, they got a new chief exec in 2001, and they basically went for a massive period of acquirements and growth and gobbling up lots of smaller companies. So particular names here that might be familiar to people is John Lang are in there, Alfred McAlpine there. Molem is another one that's kind of major kind of... These quite a lot of big kind of contracting organisations, big civil engineering companies. And they were just growing. That was up to 2014. Now, if we skip back a little... actually, before we skip back a little, talk about how Carillion were involved in the railways. Well, they started out, so back in 1999, they had a small stake within sort of railway maintenance organisations. As you can see, here's a rather dilapidated-looking, knackered tamper. Here is the tamper, with a Carillion logo on it. There's the Carillion logo that's been sellotaped on. Looking rather dilapidated, but they started out with this. But by 2014... Carillion were Network Rail's biggest contractor, biggest individual contractor, being paid £281 million that financial year. That's if we ignore the fact that Balfour BT are bigger, but they're weirdly split into three bits. But they got paid £350 million total. So if you like, Carillion were Network Rail's second biggest contractor, but they were huge. You know, a third of a billion. The best part of £1/3 billion of contracts let and controlled by Carillion. So they're a major player. And I was doing work for Carillion. Carillion were, when I started in the industry, I was working for Atkins, and all of my work was on the Midland Main Line underneath Carillion. We were working for Carillion as part of the major kind of Midland Main Line sort of CP5, Control Period 5 kind of multi-asset framework sort of contract they had. Huge sort of kind of multi-project spanning framework of a lot of Midland Mainline stuff going on, particularly electrification, but also some of the other big civil engineering projects down there. And in fact, I was going to put it up here. I've got video footage that I was taking on site of Carillion building things. There's all people in oranges with Carillion on their back, a bit like this, and sparks flying everywhere. You know, so in the thick of it, they were building things. Now, if we roll back very slightly to October 2012, for reasons that we will explain a little bit later, October 2012, Carillion got involved in a thing called reverse factoring, and the general attitude was this was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then a fairly short period later, in March 2015, UBS, some consultants and analysts in UBS were looking at Carillion and commented on the fact that they reckoned that reverse factoring is very bad, and it was going to be really bad. So that was a bit of a flip on the old reverse factoring. We'll explain what reverse factoring is very soon, don't worry, everyone. So you just need to bear in mind that within a fairly short space of time, we went from people thinking this is a very good thing to suddenly people think it's a very bad thing. And indeed, by July 2017, Carillion are announcing £1.15 billion of losses. And I put this in inverted commas because... well, by the 13th of January 2018, things had gone from bad to worse, and the BBC started reporting that there was a matter of days to stop the collapse of Carillion. I remember this in the news, because I'd moved to a different company and was dealing with Carillion quite a bit less, and so it didn't feel quite as immediate. But I was aware of the pain that a lot of my colleagues were starting to suffer, particularly actually a lot of my project managers, because they were the commercial people were dealing with the fact that they had no idea whether the money was going to come through for the projects that they just had a load of designers working on non-stop for months. And then, sure enough, 15th of January 2018, Carillion disintegrated. It collapsed. It went into liquidation. So that was the end of Carillion. That was their demise. Samir, any of your own memories of this period, or anything that you can add over this bit of history?
I mean, I remember it seemed to kind of fall over very quickly, but clearly, like the writing was on the wall kind of months earlier. And one of the things that is often picked up is that back in July when they issued their profit warning, their shares plummeted, but of course within a matter of days they were awarded a
there was a contract of around £1.4 billion for work on HS2.
Yep.
Then a few months later, I think maybe in November, were awarded a contract in the hundreds of millions for the electrification of the, I think, London to Northampton line. So, it feels very surreal that those two things kind of coincided, given that the underlying problems in the company seem to be pretty apparent by July.
Yeah, because there are two things. I mean, two things on it. The first is that clearly people understood that there were problems, because you had analysts. This analyst from UBS in 2015 was saying there's something. There are some problems here, and they're going to come home to roost fairly soon. And people were commenting. There are private eye stories. There's all sorts. I remember reading them about Carillion really being not in a healthy state. At the same time, there were still clearly there weren't. This was not apparent to a lot of other people, because they were being awarded contracts en masse. As you say, the HS2 one is particularly for our audience here. Everyone was particularly kind of noticed the HS2 contract, and that was controversial when it went out. But also, it was awarded to Carillion. So it is interesting that that it was, and we'll talk a bit about how and why that was allowed to happen. And I think we'll probably end up talking more about that element than others. But so from those £1.15 billion losses, I've taken my rabbit ears away now, because by the end of it, turned out that they were basically in a hole for the best part of £7 billion, which is just absolutely remarkable. It's just an enormous amount of money for a single organisation like that. It's just remarkable. So that was the hit. That was the end of Carillion. That was their creation in 1999 to their total collapse in not even barely a short while later, really. It's just quite kind of, what is it? Not even 20 years and they were gone. I'm an engineer, not an mathematician. My brain just turned to jelly. It's what happens when you're having to press buttons a lot. So, what was the impact of Carillion's collapse? Well, this is worth us exploring. Matt Reed, why were Carillion awarded those contracts when they were in such a mess? We'll get to that. We will get to that. So, everything's gone blue. I'm going to go through some statistics, and I think, Samir, I'm sure you've got thoughts on some of these. Anyone in the chat who was at Carillion, just chip in with your thoughts. So there were, in the UK, at liquidation, there were 18,257 UK employees of Carillion. But globally, it's worth not forgetting sight of the fact that globally there were 43,000 employees. So this wasn't just a UK collapse. There were the same number again and more of international workers who also were finding themselves in difficult situations, and perhaps without some of the safety nets that we have in the UK. So 43,000 globally. Of the UK numbers, 4,312 were made redundant or retired or kind of left and decided to just sort of, change career within a year. So I've smooshed in the redundancy numbers in there, but the majority of those people were made redundant, and then kind of a smaller number retired or left the industry within a year. So that's 22% of their workforce. About 14,000, so 76% of the UK workforce, transferred elsewhere. So kind of were 2P'd across into other organisations. Actually, I don't know if it was 2P, but they were transferred across kind of pretty much as they were into other organisations, right?
Yeah, I don't think 2P. I mean, from a different collapse a long time back, I seem to vaguely remember that 2P doesn't apply because your employment contract is ended.
Ah, yeah, okay. So actually, it is a re-employment essentially.
That could have been. That was back in, I think that one was 2010 that I remember kind of happening, but yeah.
It was so that was a lot of people. So certainly in terms of the railways, that was people transferring either into Network Rail, or I think Amy bought up contracts and picked up a lot of the sort of the work being delivered by Carillion. So yeah, but I think my understanding within the railways, a lot of people, but essentially were brought in-house actually to deliver quite a lot of the work. So you had a lot of people suddenly finding themselves on the books in Network Rail. The other challenge, of course, with this, and I don't know to what extent I picked this up, and maybe more in suppliers, I haven't really written about it, but it's worth remembering that a lot of labour, certainly that my understanding, the workforce within the railways, a lot of it is, in terms of the people on the ballast, a lot of them are contingent workers. And so they won't have come under this list of 19, the best part of 20,000 staff. They'll have been in part of the supply chain. And these totals don't include the people who were essentially made redundant by the collapse of suppliers, which we will look at suppliers in a bit, but they're not included in this total. So I couldn't find a number for the total estimate of people made redundant. I don't know if you've got a guess on that.
So I found a figure for 75,000 people in the supply chain.
75,000.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if that's subcontractors or if that is subcontractors and suppliers, and because that would have to be an estimate, because presumably, it would just be much harder to figure out, like, if a supplier has just kind of cut back on, or a subcontractor just has made a few people redundant.
And it's actually someone who I know is a worker on a colleague on the railways. Lots of us left well before the collapse when we saw the writing on the wall. So yeah, it's interesting that there was some attrition at Carillion when people sort of started realizing that it wasn't in a good state. Some staff who could, and probably a minority who were able to just fairly quickly find work elsewhere, didn't jump. So that 75,000, is that the total number of people in the supply chain connected to Carillion rather than the redundancies? That's just the total number, right?
Yeah. That's the stat I got, is that people worked in its supply chain but not necessarily lost their jobs, but would have been affected. Yeah,
with Carillion. Yeah, don't worry, my wonderful handwriting there associated with Carillion. And then so if we assume, so you're looking at thousands of people who are made redundant. 4,500 redundant or retired or left within a year. That's just within the 20,000 in the UK. You can extrapolate those numbers across the organisations, as we'll talk about suppliers. Worth highlighting, and it was mentioned in Twitter actually, that about 1,200 apprentices were dumped, which was, for one company, was nearly 2% of all UK construction apprentices. There's a huge number. And the thing about apprentices, I think that's why it's worth mentioning them specifically, is because these aren't just, they're not graduates who at least have got a degree, have got some level of transferability after. These are young people in the main who are kind of career-wise pretty vulnerable. They're entirely reliant on their employer giving them everything they need in terms of both training and salary. So for them to have the rug pulled out from underneath them, that was, and actually this was quite a controversy in and of itself. I think the treatment of the apprentices within Carillion and what happened to them. Some were picked up elsewhere, but the vast majority just had to start their career again. So not a good situation. And this was right at the peak when we were supposed to be pushing apprentices. Apprentices were supposed to be the most amazing thing. Everyone should become an apprentice, and then all of a sudden the rug's pulled right out underneath them. Have you had any apprentices come forward to speak to you in the project, Samir?
No. I mean, so far it's mainly been subcontractors. Interestingly.
Okay.
Well, I mean, like, one subcontractor I spoke to, they provided more like services like grounds maintenance, winter services, including at railway stations, but across the country in the States, and they made about 10% of their workforce redundant, like, overnight because of what happened.
Yeah.
And interestingly, what they said was what kept them afloat, because they were at risk of collapse, was the beast from the east. So their winter services became suddenly in great demand. And that kind of basically kept them from being in kind of like even more kind of serious rates. But at the time, like, a lot of subcontractors weren't willing to speak out, because they were concerned that if they were highlighted as being affected by this, they would be seen to have, like, the contagion of association with Carillion, that they would be financially unstable or unviable. So
and then there's the risk that there's flight, and then that would be cascade effect. Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, this is partly where the story becomes interesting. You've got these macro effects, and something like the beast from the east being a situation that that rescues some of the service providers. That is quite interesting. I hadn't even thought about some of that. It's worth, and we're going to touch on the big four later. It's worth saying that I've put a little asterisk next to the people who are made redundant, because it's worth noting that PricewaterhouseCoopers withheld redundancy package information from some of the workers who've been made redundant and who are looking to kind of be able to support their families or be able to pay the rent, and PwC was and suffered grief for the fact that they withheld redundancy package information. So I don't know if you've come across that, but yeah, we'll perhaps touch on that when we get to the Big Four later, because it's. I don't think it reflects well on. I don't think any of this story reflects well on the Big Four, to be honest. But we'll get there. So what else? The pension liabilities. So there were 27,000 members of 13 different pension schemes associated with Carillion, and all of them took a pension hit of varying sizes. I don't think anyone entirely lost their pension. I was trying to work out if that was the situation. I don't think anyone entirely lost it, but there was certainly there was a pension hit of kind of quite varying sizes to all of the 27,000 members of these pension schemes, I believe. Which is never hit people's pensions. It's really not an ideal situation, and people aren't going to be very happy if you do that, and it makes their lives a lot harder. So pensions. Another element was about delayed projects and the fact that you had all these contracts, the physical projects that Carillion were working on that suddenly they weren't working on anymore. And actually, I have found it impossible to build up a decent idea of cost. There's some small figures of the government only had to bail out £150 million worth on projects, but this just does not. This is not well reflected. I don't think this adds up, to be honest, because the scale of the projects, the scale of the disruption, and then the unforeseen situation where actually, you had. You've got these delayed projects. All these costs, or almost all these costs, were borne by local or national authorities. There were, I think, around 300 contracts that needed to be transferred. But again, I'm not quite sure what the sort of Venn diagram of how that's categorized. But the key thing is that on all these, it was stories of these projects, the delays to these projects, in turn result in delays or indeed cancellations of other projects, particularly for the local authority ones. National ones, perhaps not so much, but for the local authority ones, where local authorities can't borrow money in the same way the government can. It'd be nice if they could, they can't. And so if they're up against it with cash flow, on actually providing cash flow to these contracts, they really do just have to cancel projects that were supposed to be delivered. So delays. So there are real hits to sort of city projects as a result of some of the failures. And the hospitals are an example, but there are also sort of big public realm works. There are quite a few major Carillion projects in some of the big cities. In fact, Liverpool and Manchester had Carillion projects that were delayed. Samir, anything on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the figure must be higher than as you said, like 150 million, if only because one of the the kind of the short-term causes of its collapse was several projects going quite significantly over budget. Like I think a bypass in Scotland.
Yeah. The Aberdeen, but the AWPR, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, the bypass. I wrote my first civil engineering project paper on that when I was like 11. It took a while.
Yeah, so it would seem extraordinary that there wouldn't be kind of like greater cost to government, if only because like it was already over cost.
Yeah.
And then I've worked in local authorities, and just the kind of the cost of having to shift all of the priorities and find a new contractor, relet it.
Yeah.
You can't easily just find someone to like pick it up on the next day.
Yeah, this is it. It's another thing. You're right. It's not just the capital cost, which the council's almost got ring fenced, and it's coming via government. So that's not. But it's the fact that they're incredibly thin on the ground operational, day-to-day running costs that councils just don't have it. They've had 50% cuts in some cases. I know from experience of dealing with the council in York, they have they have such a small number of officers for given projects, and they're all stretched hopelessly thin. So then have to relet all the contracts, write new contract documents, pay for lawyers to check them, all this pain. Good grief, yeah, absolutely. The Crofter is pointing out there's a certain irony that Carillion was building the new Paradise building in Birmingham for PricewaterhouseCoopers. Yeah, well, indeed.
We'll get conflict of interest later.
Yeah, well, quite. Yeah, so right. So in terms of suppliers, I think it's obviously the impact on people on staff is key. But I think this kind of section on suppliers relates back to that as well, and I think is important. These aren't just companies. Oh, it doesn't matter if these companies go bust, whatever. No, these are generally the sorts of suppliers to a big contracting organisation are ones that are supplying physical things, and therefore there are a lot of people relying on generally a higher percentage of lower paid workers who very much relying on the work that these suppliers are providing. So so you had of the nearly £7 billion pounds of kind of total post liquidation liabilities. That was, by the way, 3 times Carillion's declared amount. They declared 3 times less than that when they actually initially went bust. But anyway, so I believe £1 billion plus was owed straight to suppliers. Of that, 30,000 plus small businesses were out of pocket. An average of nearly £100,000 was owed to micro suppliers. So that's like 0 to 10 workers. So some of that will be individual consultants and contractors, small businesses that think, oh, you know what, we've got a little thing here, we're going to supply to Carillion, it'd be great. And they were owed, on average, £100,000 for a little business. Like £100,000 being owed to a little business like that is just catastrophic. Like presumably you'd be wiped out if you had that level of debt. An average of nearly 250,000 was owed to kind of medium-sized suppliers. So that's 50 to 249 workers. So these are huge figures, and actually, some suppliers were losing as much as 1.4 million. I think that was the largest loss to one of these kind of medium-sized suppliers. Absolutely tremendous kind of losses, and you can sort of trace. It's a bit like excess deaths with COVID. You could every year a certain number of businesses become insolvent in a year, and if they subtracted kind of the average amount, hundreds of new suppliers that you wouldn't expect to fell into insolvency in the first quarter of 2018, immediately after the collapse of Carillion. So that's a huge number of businesses just absolutely wiped out by Carillion. So it wasn't just Carillion; it was all the organisations relying on it. And I think my last word on this, before I kind of I hand over to Samir to maybe talk on this a bit, is what choice did and indeed still do these suppliers have when such a sizable proportion of work, such a sizable proportion of the work being done by an entire country is going through one organisation. These suppliers don't have the choice to be able to be like, we're not going to work with Carillion, they're clearly dodgy. They have to work with these organisations because such a high volume of spend is happening. Particularly regionally, if a regional project is being run by Carillion, there is no other major source of income for sort of, if you're a supplier of certain types of materials or staff. What can you do? Samir, I'm sure you've got thoughts on this bit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that that's worth noting as well is that for those small businesses that survived but were out of pocket, they're still out of pocket. They've not had their money. So this is still like debt that's on their balance sheets or on kind of hanging over them, and they've had to live with that, and they still live with the financial impact of that, kind of like 4 years on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. And I think as well, like, your point around what happens when effectively, kind of one company has so much of the work within it. It's actually, it becomes monopolistic, and that you kind of wonder, like, what is it doing that either the state couldn't do in a more accountable way, or and even I think even then, if you're not directly dealing with Carillion, you might be indirectly dealing with it. You might not be a prime subcontractor, but presumably you could be a subcontractor, or it could be contracted down to you as well. So your exposure to it would still be kind of pretty significant.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like construction in particular, like I think services, maybe their exposure was less bad because when the administrators took over, like if you have a contract to maintain a train station with Carillion, when it's taken over by the administrators, the administrators are pretty interested in keeping you on to kind of keep it going. That's kind of that's the difference between that and if you've got half of a hospital built and then suddenly like it all goes, like who knows where the information is kept anymore, or meant to turn up tomorrow or anything. It's utterly chaotic and also like the construction sector just works in a very different way. It's far more vulnerable to those kind of shocks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and we'll definitely touch on a few you're asking in here about the base of nationalisation, or how what those impacts are. Don't worry, we'll be very much touching on that again later in the episode about those kind of impacts and the way that big monopolies work and how it ends up in that situation. So I think to sort of summarise this, suppliers are sort of trapped really by this sort of scale of monopolism when it came to Carillion. And the impact, as you say, across service providers and construction companies, suppliers, design. Some of the organisations not on here are companies like the ones that Atkins, the design consultancy that I used to work for, when they had huge contracts with Arup as well. Both had major contracts with Carillion. They'll have taken it on the chin. And they also have major lawyer teams who are quite good at negotiating with the liquid, the administrators, and probably they'll have made big losses, but as a percentage, I dare say they won't have suffered so badly. And also, they can absorb some of that pain. They can retask designers to do work on other projects. They can, or indeed, as a lot of the case was, those projects ended up being delivered by someone else. So actually, they just re-engaged again after a short pause. So those large organisations probably didn't suffer too much. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure that Atkins and Arup suffered a big hit. My current consultancy that I work for, Arcadis, invariably had Carillion contracts, will have taken a bit of a hit. But I don't think so much as some of the small and medium enterprises are the ones I think that are the most exposed, because they don't have the legal, they don't have the lawyers, they don't have the cash flow, they don't have the liquidity, they don't have the money in the bank fundamentally to sort of ride out that sort of pain. I think the small and medium enterprises really suffered. So I think the next thing to talk about is why the hell this happened, because there's a risk that this this bit might go long, because it does get fiddly. Oh my goodness. So why did Carillion collapse? Well, to start with, in fact, I'm going to get rid of our faces for this bit, because I managed to do graphs that are definitely going to be underneath our faces. So we'll be back shortly. Don't worry, everyone. Firstly, here is a graph. Now, this graph is covering the period from 2009 to 2018 for those in audio-only form. And the y-axis here has some values on it. And there are 3 lines. So the bottom line there, the solid line, is operational income. So that's the cash coming into Carillion from 2009 towards 2018. And you can see that there's a bit of a surge in 2014, but for the most part, it's a downward trend, and it becomes catastrophically downwards from kind of 2016 onwards. Not healthy. So the other line here, this kind of dashed line at the top, is the pension deficit. So this is how much, this is the size of the pension deficit up here. And you can see that pension deficit is climbing year on year. It's increasing. So they're not paying down their pension liabilities annually. The other line is this dotted line, which is dividends paid. Now, you'll notice the thing with this dividends paid line, and actually, on this scale, you can't quite see it, but actually, this pretty much climbed every year, other than in 2017 when they announced a load of losses. And indeed, it climbed again between 2017 and 2018. So they were continuing to kind of, these dividends were climbing year on year. So the number one thing that we can see here from this is that the shareholder dividends were being paid out before Carillion was satisfying their pension commitments, which meant climbing debt and not a very healthy state to be in for its workers. But shareholder dividends were being paid before pension commitments. But that's not the end of the story. In fact, it's barely the start of the story. So if we go back to this little graph, I've changed the scale slightly so you can see there's more space at the top, because fundamentally what that meant was that over time, the total debts owed, so if your pension deficit is climbing and climbing, your operational income is dropping, but you're still paying dividends the same year on year, then your total debts owed are just going to climb and climb. And so this, sure enough, by the time you're reaching, 2018, the debts are, $1.5 billion of debts and climbing. It's just, this was not a healthy situation. But how did this happen? How did it reach this point? How was this level of debt possible? And the first way that this level of debt was possible is reverse factoring, the thing which I mentioned earlier, reverse factoring. Now, Samir and I are going to stay quiet for a moment because we're going to let our friends from we're going to let Riley and Alice and Hussein and the Trash Future crew explain what reverse factoring is, because frankly it's very fiddly and they'll do a better and probably funnier job of it than I can. So we're going to let the Trash Future crew tell us for a couple of minutes. Take it away, Riley.
To remind you, reverse factoring is when a company handles its accounts payable by a third party. So suppliers accept a cut but get paid today rather than in the future.
Yeah, I outsource my debts.
Yeah, I'm owed $100. I accept 98, so I get paid today instead of in the future. And what makes this so incredibly pernicious is that this basically means that companies are able to turn their entire supply chain into a personal bank that they can then invent new credit out of thin air. Companies have effectively been able to print money in some cases, but without it showing up as debt. So a lot of what happens is a large company will extend their payment schedule to some ludicrous amount of time, say like 120, 160 days. And then say if you want to be paid in 30 days, which is a normal amount of time for an invoice to be processed, you must use our reverse factoring partner and therefore accept a reduced amount of the invoice. And the crazy thing is that effectively turns the company's accounts payable, so the things I have to pay you as a supplier of items to my company, that turns that from just normal operating expenses into debt, which is then owed to a financial institution, can be renegotiated, but most importantly, securitized and sold.
I mean, let's be clear. There's two parts of this, right? There's the reverse factoring part in and of itself is literally just this Australian monorail guy comes to your company and offers to give you the money printer that governments have. And then for as long as that works, you can just be like, brrr, and print out all of the stuff that you would normally be paying for, like, I don't know, the fuel to run your machines or the electricity to keep your lights on, just off of the back of this, like, black box Australian corporation. The other half of that is that what that Australian corporation is doing with that debt is sort of turning it into a financial instrument that it can gamble with.
That's correct. That's
the
exactly
dollar
right.
machine, which fuels the bond machine.
It feels normal, innovative, something that we've never seen before, and something that I feel will just be fine.
So there we go. Thanks, Riley, for letting me clip that out of Trash Future. Strong recommend, and I'm going to plug it again at the end. Go and listen to Frankenstein's balance sheet, because it's a fantastic explanation of how absolutely doolally this is. So that was Trash Future explaining what reverse factoring is. Now, in Carillion's case, this came down to enter Carillion's early payment facility, which was a scheme by which suppliers took a financial hit if they didn't sign up to this EPF, the early payment facility, which, exactly as Riley explains, took their payment schedules from this ridiculous contrived 120, 160 days, I think it was even, down to a more regular 30 days, but with a financial hit, which, as, again, Riley explained, basically turned the whole of their sort of supply chain, all of their suppliers, into their own personal bank. We'll explain precisely, well, kind of not precisely, but broadly how that worked next. But that's number one thing. Related to that is also this guy. It's David Cameron. Hooray! Oh golly, yeah. This Samir. This took me on such a rabbit hole. Honestly, I didn't realize quite how much this was going to come full circle, but it did. So we've got Carillion's early payment facility, and we've got David Cameron. What ties these two together? So let's jump to the Financial Times. In fact, let's bring Samir's face. Let's get our little faces back in the corner again. Hi, Samir. We're both back. So, this is right. I strongly recommend that you look up this Financial Times long read. It's well worth a read, everyone. It's very helpful to explain the context of this. But this just gets grubbier and grubbier, because this reverse factoring was essentially invented. Well, not essentially. It was invented by Australian financier Lex Greensill, and if you remember, I put it as a timeline point, October 2012, and I'm actually going to read a little extract from the piece because I think it's worth reading. So we've had so much reading, but I'm going to read a little bit more because I think it's worth just reading this in detail. So this is from the Financial Times piece. In fact, I'm going to have to get rid of our faces again so I can read it through. So, and I'm going to highlight bits that I think are relevant to highlight. But in fact, I'm going to get me red pen out because I think this is... there we are. Right, so... It was October 2012 and David Cameron was flanked by senior ministers as well as Australian financier Lex Greensill as he announced a new scheme designed to speed up payments to government suppliers. That's right, everyone. This is me again talking. David Cameron announced this reverse factoring thing with his chum Lex Greensill. Here we go. So, the then British Prime Minister described the Supply Chain Finance Initiative as a win-win for industry when the UK had only just emerged from recession. Under the scheme, suppliers' bills were settled up front by banks for a small charge rather than the typical 60 to 90-day wait with contractors. The aim was to ease their cash flow at a time when banks were wary of traditional lending. Cameron had no idea he was helping create a central plank in Carillion's later scandal. So let's skip forwards. In the midst of the crisis around Greensill Capital, everyone remember Greensill Capital? It went bust recently. The Carillion thing has become a footnote. And indeed, all of this basically something that Greensill helped kind of create. So that can be traced right back to the Cameron announcement. And so this is worth pointing out. Carillion's use of supply chain finance became contentious because shortly after the scheme was launched, the company extended its maximum payment times to suppliers from 65 to 120 days, in effect forcing subcontractors to use this scheme, the EPF scheme, even if they had to pay a price. And then it's sort of we've move on to the next bit, and it says Cameron absolutely pushed the supply chain finance initiative and sent a letter to the government's 20 biggest suppliers urging them to come to a meeting at 10 Downing Street where they were pressed to use the scheme, according to one person close to Carillion. Carillion never used Greensill, but its finance team had several meetings with the entrepreneur, who was working as an unpaid advisor in the Cabinet Office. Wait, what? With his own desk and a team of 4 civil servants. Executives had stars in their eyes about him, said one former employee. According to people briefed on the plans, Carillion set up its early payment facility, its own version of the scheme Cameron announced, after meeting Greensill. Senior executives at some of the government's other big UK contractors were also called in to meet the entrepreneur. Right, I have to do my biggest, contractor boss voice now. There was no real threat. But there was a certain pressure put on because the government was a big client, said the head of one of the then FTSE 100 contractors. I thought it was odd that Number 10 pushed the scheme as Greensill was not a government official and interest rates were low at the time. I don't know why I've made him some sort of wheelered car dealer, but I've decided that's the situation. And another executive said that you aren't going to bite the hand that feeds you. So there you go. This is sort of tracing back to our friend David Cameron here, and for me this is really important. Sorry, Samir, I've left you hanging for a long time, but I thought it was worth sort of exploring this sort of cozy, weird situation where a guy who owns a company that makes a lot of money out of these schemes is also appointed as someone in government to advise companies to use the schemes that will profit his company that he owns. I'm sure that's all fine, isn't it, Samir, right?
Yeah, it's horrifically dodgy, and Greensill is one of the other places that I thought of looking at in terms of an audit failure as well. But one of the other things I think is kind of worth noting is that, so in my discussion with some of the subcontractors, they were talking about how, before the financing facility and reverse factoring, they were being paid month end plus 90 plus 1. They were being paid late. Yeah. And what was late according to the government guidelines of the day. So these are government contracts that were being paid late when its guidelines to places beyond government was pay your contractors.
Yeah, there are initiatives and regulatory frameworks saying there's the timely payment scheme to make sure that you get paid within 30 days. There are lots of schemes saying pay subcontractors within a healthy time. And at the same time, Cameron was here shouting about, oh no, delay that. Yes, well, we're not delaying it because everyone's going to obviously sign up to this clever reverse factoring scheme. Anyway, so David Cameron and Greensill. Now, if we go back to our little faces, I'm sure there's no connection between them. These two cozy chums having a little coffee here in a sort of is this like a Bedouin tent? It's very nice for them. Anyway, they're having a nice. It couldn't possibly be the Greensill that David Cameron then moved straight to after being Prime Minister. That couldn't possibly be the same Greensill, no. And not the Greensill that that he then used, and within Greensill was pushing government and sending WhatsApp messages to force the NHS to use some of Greensill's dodgy accounting methods, which were later found to provide no benefit to the NHS despite Greensill earning money for them. No, it's not. It's a different Greensill, surely. It's definitely it's a different Greensill and a different David Cameron. I'm absolutely sure of it. Anyway, so that's only one part of how this level of debt was possible. Part reverse factoring for a little bit. The other reason was false financial statements. So when I say false financial statements, I mean literally fake financial statements created that were completely fake. Not even just like fiddled, but fake. And this leads us on to the Big Four. And maybe Samir, if I put the logos of the Big Four up, maybe you can kind of explain what the Big Four are and how their kind of their kind of fiddling of financial statements led to a situation where Carillion could hide this level of debt and problem.
So the Big Four are essentially kind of the Big Four providers of audit services in the UK, and so it's pretty likely that if you're a big company, your auditor is one of these people, and they've come in for a huge amount of criticism over the years, very justifiably and understandably, because they don't appear to be doing a great job at auditing, and this is the opinion of the Financial Reporting Council as well, who've talked about how as many as 1 in 3 audits are just kind of poorly done. And so at Carillion, their external auditor was KPMG. Their internal audit services were provided by Deloitte. And then when they kind of got into trouble, Ernst & Young provided turnaround advice worth £10 million. So there's nothing better about being in debt than getting further in debt. And then when it came to managing the insolvency process, the last kind of man standing was, of course, PricewaterhouseCoopers, who earned, in the first 8 weeks of their work, earned around an estimated £20 million. So KPMG in particular were heavily criticised as the external auditor. The external audit is meant to, provide challenge, and is meant to kind of like haul you over the coals a bit and point out everything you're doing wrong. And they were accused of being essentially complicit in the company's accounting practices that were, masking all of these serious financial problems. And one of the quotes from there was a parliamentary session about a select committee session. They said that they were complacently signing off its directors' increasingly fantastical figures.
Yeah, it was just absolutely. It's just mind blowing that this was, because I suppose if I just cut in for momentarily, the point of financial statements they're not a sales pitch. They're supposed to be a way for suppliers, other contractors, clients to understand the health of a company's finances. They're not supposed to be a sales pitch. They're supposed to just be a matter-of-fact statement of the health of a company. But they've turned into a thing that now they're a tool for tax evasion or tax avoidance. They're a tool for using as a sales pitch. They're a tool for building shareholder wealth, and facilitated by the Big Four.
Yeah, and so interestingly as well, Deloitte, as the internal auditors, were accused of failing to notice or ignore terminal failings, quote, at Carillion. And, when the Financial Reporting Council did their investigation, they've ultimately kind of, so in September of last year, they announced a kind of like a formal complaint. I think it was kind of called into KPMG, and it alleges that specific people within KPMG provided false and misleading information and documents as part of the audit of Carillion's accounts in 2016. And hot off the back of that, the official receiver, who who was dealing with this with this kind of like collapsing company, has lodged a claim worth £1 billion against up to £1 billion against KPMG, and the hearing for that is just starting.
Okay, yeah.
So one of the kind of like the themes that seems to kind of come out from all of it is, Carillion were very good or very aggressive at hiding their debt, and hence the reverse factoring issue. And both in terms of some of the domestic projects that were going over budget, but then also there was international projects that essentially kind of the payment was being withheld or was not forthcoming, and that was they were kind of essentially kind of trying to hide their levels of debt. And then when I was interviewing one of the subcontractors about this, they talked about how when things started to go downhill from like July 2017, Carillion would be they would be paying them, but they would dodge giving them a purchase order, so that they couldn't issue an invoice, because if you issued an invoice, then it would show up as a creditor on their balance sheet, and so therefore you'd look like you'd show how much debt you were incurring. Whereas if you could hold that off, you could have all of the money from that you're meant to be passing on to these suppliers and subcontractors, and not have the debt, and is another manipulation.
That's interesting, because, and I wouldn't want to cast any aspersions on my commercial colleagues at my former employer, but I remember them having headaches dealing with and kind of half-heard conversations that I heard my commercial shout out to Kenny Crockett, hero, commercial manager at my former employer, sort of having very long, stressed conversations, trying to understand why, half-heard conversations that sound similar to that, actually, with challenges with invoicing and the discussions. Atkins weren't in contract. So Control Period 5 started in 2014. I think it took I think possibly the contracts had not even been finalised for the rates that Carillion were going to pay Atkins, even by their collapse, because there were back and forth discussions with Carillion clearly trying to squeeze what they could. And so it's an indication of a very aggressive accounting and kind of commercial strategy, combined with some of this shady stuff going on. It's really not a healthy situation, at all. Sorry, I interrupted again.
Oh no, I think I got to the end of my point. But this is perhaps kind of one of the, and also like as you were saying earlier, that because through the reverse factoring, the suppliers were being used basically as an income source into the company as well. They seem to be basically doing whatever they could to make their balance sheet look better than it was. So it's perhaps no surprise that there is actual kind of dishonesty in terms of the providing of information kind of going on as well. But what's the point of if you got to kind of wonder what your auditors are doing if they can't see this. And it was obvious that the criticism is that it would have been hard not to have seen any of this and for them not to have raised red flags, but they didn't. And the criticism being that that actually in these relationships have become very cozy, and no one wants to kind of be giving bad news.
Yeah, you're not going to be awarded the contract again to do the auditing if you don't tick the box at the end of the sheet. As someone's pointed out in the chat, in fact, there's no you're not going to get employed. KPMG or Deloitte or EY or PwC are not going to get asked to come back if they say nasty, mean things to the person holding the person holding the cash and with their name hovering over the signed check. So yeah, it's problematic, and this is where the regulators come in. But the regulators are increasingly toothless. They're powerless to really resolve this. And all of the official reports pointed out that the regulators essentially have no teeth to actually resolve any of these problems anyway. Yeah. So let's crack on. Conscious of time, I've already broken your hour, and I'm taking away your evening from you. But these two factors, these two issues, sorry. So the reverse factoring and the fiddled and faked financial statements. So kind of thing number one, I've gone red, and thing number two, both of those. They, not only did they hide the mess, but they enabled the mess. So it was kind of a bit of a kind of a feedback loop. They enabled the mess, and then they also hid the mess, which meant that the red flags that should have been flicking up did not.
How saddened I am by all of.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do, which is fix my slide deck because I've forgotten to make a thing happen. You can all enjoy that the former CEO of Carillion getting very upset with himself. There we are. There we are. There we are. On the fly video editing. Here we go. Look at that. Professional.
How saddened I am by all of the events.
Deeply saddened, and how sorry I am.
I'm very sorry for what's happened.
I am deeply sorry for the impact that the collapse of the company had.
No, they're not. They're not sorry at all. They're not sorry. That was a load of people saying that they're very sorry that they're ever so sorry that it collapsed, but they're not. Of course, they aren't remotely sorry at all. I always find it weird when you have these executives who clearly don't care. I'm not saying that they're evil people, but they were operating within a climate, and they were presiding over an organization that just resulted in tens of thousands of people losing their job, thousands of redundancy. Oh, sorry, thousands of people losing their job. Lots of people probably resulting in families being destroyed, potentially people losing their, taking their own life, all of the known consequences of work being taken away from people, of people being made redundant, all of the social impacts of that. And then, it would almost be better if they didn't apologize. It's like this, who are they performing for here? Anyway, I'm very angry at looking at these people apologizing, so let's move on. Oh, what can we learn from this? Well, I've turned the slide deck red, which should give hints to long-time Railnatter watchers. So this is an interesting quote from Keith Cochrane, who I don't know what Keith Cochrane sounds like, but I'm going to make him regional. But he was the Carillion CEO at the time in 2017, September 2017. Actually, he was shortly after that he was booted out. But he quoted this. He said, "We were building a Rolls Royce, but only getting paid to build a Mini." I don't know why he's from Middlesbrough, but he is. It's that quote, building a Rolls Royce, but only getting paid to build a Mini, comes back to some of the lack of project health. And this, for me, this quote speaks to a far deeper problem, which is this. It's the idea of successive UK governments convincing themselves that they can build and maintain a functioning society at less than the going rate. And how do they believe that they can do this? They believe they can do this by outsourcing to increasingly ungainly organisations that cannot bend reality, so attempt to bend their finances. That for me is that's the deeper issue here. It's not just outsourcing is bad. It's the idea that we can deliver a society that works for everyone at less than the cost that it clearly is to deliver that. And the only way we can act, and we send it to, and somehow that governments of both stripes, of all stripes, believe that the way to do this is by giving it to companies who give them the right answer back. But the only way they can achieve that is by all of this financial chaos that we've just witnessed. I don't know. That for me feels like the kind of the deep baseline lesson underneath all of this. Samir, I don't know if that kind of reflects your views and beliefs, kind of having kind of looked through this and working through this, the kind of the project.
I mean, I think I'm perhaps a bit more skeptical of outsourcing per se, but I think that, definitely in especially kind of post financial crisis and austerity, the solution to making budgets make sense both at a national government level and at a local government level is to squeeze the contractors and to kind of find money through the contractors, which is a false economy.
Yep.
And I think the point around the kind of just how much work is being channeled through increasingly huge suppliers that earn large amounts of their work through the public sector is just
it becomes that kind of strange thing of like, at what point are you a private sector company that works mainly in doing like public sector stuff versus, for example, in other countries where public sector owned companies do private sector work.
Yeah, exactly. It's and it comes back to the railways, to the discussion that we have about railways. The franchise companies, ever increasingly towards the collapse of the franchising system, were organisations that had no control over anything. The only thing they had control over was staffing rate, was staff. The only thing they had control over was staff, which actually is very similar to the situation with some of these big outsourcing organisations. And so ultimately, they are, whether they are legally recorded as such or not, they are essentially state organisations. They are, all of the money that comes from the state, they're delivering state services. At which point, you start realizing, well, okay, well, why is there a profit? Where's the profit motive coming through this, and where's the value? And what value is this adding? Is the value just that they can bend finances in a way that the public sector can't? And at which point is that hugely unhealthy? Well, yes, it is. And obviously, and you don't necessarily have to buy into these, Samir, but it's actually, fundamentally, this comes back to the theme, the thread that runs through so many Rail Natter episodes, which is that this becomes a Treasury issue. Actually, Treasury's lack of interest in investing, and their desire desperately to invest as little as possible and to have as little on their own balance sheet as possible, leads to some of these behaviours. So, obviously, we have to abolish the Treasury. That's obviously a thing that we have to do. But also, capitalism is broken and the UK is horribly corrupt. There was a thing recently where it's like people got very unhappy with someone accused, I can't remember who it was, someone accused the UK of being corrupt. And someone's like, no, it's not the UK that's corrupt. It's just our government. It's just, Boris and the Tories are corrupt. It's like, no, the whole UK is a horribly corrupt country. Why have we kidded? Just because we don't give tenors to police on the street corner doesn't mean that this is not arguably, that's a significantly less bad form of corruption than the horrible high-level corruption that impacts on all of us that we have in the UK. We've got our own breed of special broken country corruption that we do here, as evidenced by this cheerful chappie here, who wrecked the country more, got $10 million, and then tried to fleece the NHS and then ran off and is fine. He's fine. Don't worry about David. He's all right. Oh, anyway, Samir, I'm sure you probably haven't got anything to add to all that. We can just look at this man's shiny face here. Yeah, there we are. Right.
It's often like on the corruption issue. Like I think there's often the view that corruption is something that happens basically in poorer countries in the world. That you couldn't possibly have corruption in the UK. And as you said, like that kind of like the daily kind of paying the police officer off with the tenor is going to sort of like whatever. Whereas actually, kind of even if you're just looking at some of the COVID contract stuff kind of recently, it's pretty kind of brazen, kind of what's happening. It's
just it's so many layers of like sort of post-colonial exceptionalism that we think that we are, this country doesn't do corruption. We don't do corruption. It's all the other foreigner countries that do corruption. It's like, yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, hopefully people have been availed of that belief following all of the COVID sort of emerging kind of belief, stuff around contracts for PPE and what have you. I'm hoping that people will have been broken out of that a bit and people will be a bit more cynical. But anyway, right. I've taken up already 13 minutes beyond the hour, which is, I suppose, not too bad for a Rail Natter these days. Before we come back to Samir to talk a bit about a project specifically, in fact, the reason why Samir's on, we must whiz through to end the episode. So, in audio-only form as ever, listen on. Hopefully this worked in audio-only format, I don't know, but there are lots of funny pictures, so you're missing out on some of the gags, and also you're missing out on me sketching money bags, so, you're missing out on all the good stuff, audio-only listeners, but available on all podcasting platforms. The usual plugs, patreon.com/Gareth Dennis for more of this sort of thing. The merchandise, I need to actually speak to the Masquette. Send me a DM because I need to speak to you because I haven't actually talked about how many people have bought, but I saw a lot of masks at the live recording over the weekend, which means presumably some people have bought merchandise, which is both odd and fun. PayPal.me/Gareth Dennis for pennies and GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord for the continued chatter after the episode. Also, thanks very much to Riley, who I DM'd and asked if I could steal that snippet, which I think nicely explained reverse factoring. But go and listen to the episode; it's a brilliant episode, and also just listen to Trash Future; it's brilliant. And right, so Samir, I've put up a screenshot from the website, which I'll put a link to in the description of the video. But I thought it's a chance for you to talk about the project. So I'll bring our little faces back. It's a chance for you to tell everyone about the project, and also a call to action for anyone who's involved.
Yep. So yeah, just briefly, I'm still looking to talk to people who are directly affected by the collapse of Carillion, and essentially you can kind of reach out to me on Twitter. It's pretty easy. I'm on @SAJERAJ, so my name. And probably take maybe like a half-hour interview and write up, and then it'll be essentially be used to illustrate what the impact of these kind of like failures of auditors has on people, businesses, and communities.
Absolutely, it's that the impact. It's something that is easy to forget for the auditors. They're sufficiently distanced from it that they forget. But it's worth us always thinking about the human impact of these sorts of quite broad and ethereal financial things. They have a real world impact on people. There are people in the chat here who were let down by Carillion. There, thousands and thousands of people across not just the UK but the whole planet were let down by the collapse of Carillion, and let down by those who should have known better and should have been keeping an eye on the problems. So yeah, absolutely reach out, and yeah, I'll make sure to put the website up and the ways that you can contact Samir, so that you can get in touch. Samir, that's been brilliant. And indeed, before we come back to Samir, it's worth saying that next week it's a pre-record, but it was the live pre-record in front of a studio audience. So this was it's the 100th episode next week, which is very strange. So this was the 99th episode technically, even though it was episode 98. So yeah, next week, the good and bad ways to stop errant trains. It's the buffer stop episode at last. I'll be putting it together properly tonight, I think. So. Stay tuned for that. That'll be next week. I'll be looking forward to it. And I'm recording a very good episode at the same time as the pre-record goes out. I'll be recording another pre-record, which will be going out a couple of weeks later, which should be fun, but I'm not telling you about that. Next week's episode was in support of York LGBT Forum. It's our first sort of charity money-raising episode as well, and that worked quite nicely. So it's brilliant. I'm looking forward to you all seeing it. And now back to Samir to say, Samir, that has been absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much for coming on.
For inviting me.
No, it's been a pleasure. Me excitedly kind of ranting onwards. But it was useful to have you kind of pinning me down a bit and bringing a bit of reality back to matters. So no, thanks so much for joining, and an absolute pleasure. Everyone in the chat, thanks for joining us as well, and we will see you. I'll see you all next week. Basically, Samir, unless you've got any last words but no, me neither. I think I'm spent. I've talked about David Cameron too much for one episode, so I think I'm exhausted. I need to go and have a cold shower. Everyone, we'll see you next week. Samir, thanks so much. Cheerio, everyone. Cheerio.